Welcome back to America's Fractured Politics. I'm very happy to have with me today Ron Keffer. Those of you on Substack who know Ron for his incisive posts and his efforts to introduce readers to other work, Ron has a passion and a sense of right and wrong, which I find absolutely refreshing, and that have caused me to admire him from soon after I became familiar with his work. Ron, welcome.
Hi, Mark. Good to see
Good to
you
see you
again.
too. Let me just kick it off. In your notes, you've expressed some deep frustration and anger with the electorate that gave us Trump. It's been 7 months now. Do you think any of them are reconsidering, or are the bulk of them hopeless?
That's a good question, and I've paid attention to that. What I have seen is in the data is that most of the Republicans who voted for Trump still would probably vote for him again, like 80 to 85%. But that's down from where it was when he first got elected. It's the numbers are eroding, and also when you go across other demographics. Uh, Non-voters are that's one that interests me, and non-voters, his approval rating among them has declined considerably as well. Independents, generally, people uh, are moving away from him, which is not surprising since much of what he's done is really odious. Um, so I think we're seeing movement in the right direction. It's been a lot slower than I had hoped it would be, but I think it's going to accelerate as the fight over the big ugly bill continues in September.
I think you're right, and I think that he's wearing out his welcome very quickly. He's diverting attention from the Epstein files with Russia and Ukraine, and with his journey into the streets of Washington and the various other things he's doing. And I just happen to think his shelf life is shorter than people realize.
He seems really frantic. And since I'm in Alaska, I was paying really careful attention to what went on Friday. And one thing that I noticed when he came out of the room with Putin was the look on his face was one, uh, he looked like he'd been scared to
He looked
death, which
tight.
he very well may
He
have
looked
been.
tight. He looked very
Pardon?
tight.
Yes. So, I think he's frantic and he's feeling a little bit desperate and maybe more than a little bit desperate because things aren't going his way. What do you think about
What I
that?
think about it is that he's desperate because his relationship with Putin is a lot more fragile than people may realize. Putin calls the shots. And I think Putin basically read him the riot act in there and told him, look, there's going to be a land swap and you'd better persuade him of that. That's what I think happened
Hmm.
in there.
I have the same impression. Um, and of course, one of the things that is a motivating force for Trump is that he really would like to be a person of whom Putin approves. Putin is sort of his idol. I thought a long time Putin had something on him. I'm less inclined to think that anymore. I just think I think Jeff Trump just loves him and he wants him to
I'm
approve of
inclined
him.
in the same direction. I thought he had something on him too, but, you'd think by now that that would have manifested itself in some way or another. He just seems like a lapdog trying to get Putin's approval. And he'll never get Putin's
Yes.
approval. He's got Putin's contempt, and that's what he'll always have.
This is a stretch, and you can tell me so if you think this. But after knowing something about Trump's childhood, I think he almost sees Putin as another father from whom he can get the approval he didn't get from his
I
own
don't think it's a
father.
stretch at all. And I think Mary Trump might agree with you, as a matter of fact.
Ah,
Yeah.
yes,
Um,
yes.
Another question. The corporate media is just getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, their decline has been propitious. You know, it's been just absolutely mind-boggling. And my concern is that they are doomed after Trump is gone because their credibility is so lost. And I think a big part of that is their corporate masters have essentially said, we're lining up with Trump. We want our mergers to go through. We don't want any trouble. And along with the universities and the law firms and the other institutions, they're just basically bending the knee to a guy who has no future. And I think it's just silliness.
Right.
Um, if the Democrats are able to get office back again, get the House, the Senate, the presidency, what do you think the media is going to do at that point?
You, you know, and that's another one of our biggest conundrums. the media, the traditional media was under the gun anyway because of the big transformation of the way Americans communicate and the way they get their news. So something like a newspaper, or even a strong online paper like maybe the Times or the Wall Street Journal, their shelf life was really diminishing before Trump came along, and it's getting worse with each passing day. Also, the Trump era has spawned a lot of alternative news sites, which are pulling in a lot of listeners, viewers, readers. So I think you will either see some of the traditional news media disappear, or they will find a way to make that transition and become much more like those people who have popped up during this Trumpian era. I don't think they'll stay the same. They can't. And I know sometimes when you're inside of a big corporation and you're thinking about issues like this, it's hard to conceive making a big change. You think things will go on as they are forever. And it's only when they do change that you suddenly realize, oops, I was wrong about that. And I think that realization is going to come to the New York Times, to some of again, the Journal and some of the other big papers in the country. Um, Also, the same is true of TV networks. They're not going to be able to stay the same as they have been. And in some ways, it won't be very satisfying to look at, but in other ways, it will communicate a lot better with the average American. Do you see
I
it
do
that way,
see it
or
that way. I
some
think
other
that
way?
there's no way they're going to be the same again. Um, what's going to be interesting to me is whether or not they're balanced when we get back to normal. Are they going to continue to give the Republicans the benefit of the doubt? Because the Republicans aren't going to change. They're still going to be the same Republicans. They may be in the minority, but they'll behave the same way. Are they going to treat them as equals, as if they weren't a nihilist party that's intent on destroying the American political structure? Or are they going to basically call it as it is once the Democrats are back in power and say, mea culpa, we got it wrong. The Republicans were out to destroy this country from the beginning to the end. Trump and the Republicans proved it. We gave them too much of a break. I can't see them saying any of that, but I can see their behavior maybe changing to make a tacit admission of that.
That's a really interesting path to go down. I hadn't thought of it quite that way, but one of the first things that is suggested to me when you say that, there are underlying causes for this Trump era. There are things in this country that have not been particularly good for a very
Yeah.
long while. And the forces that have enabled the mainstream media to move into sort of a Trumpian mode are those more unpleasant, nasty aspects of American society: the racism, the xenophobia, even misogyny, and a lot of what I might call extremist religious outlooks. So, as long as those factors are still there, there will be a place for what you might call negative media. But I do think that a part of what's going to happen as we come out of this era is that those elements are going to be pushed back into the shadows and will have less of an impact. So um, I don't know how they'll do it, but I think there will have to be a resettling more toward the middle for those bigger outlets rather than hanging out on the right as they have been recently. Does that
It
make any
makes perfect
sense?
sense. Um, I want to switch gears to gerrymandering a little bit. Gavin Newsom's playing an interesting game in California. He's basically, as people keep saying, fighting fire with fire. And I think it's necessary because you're talking about 5 seats in Texas. If he can counteract that with 5 seats in California, we'll be okay. I think gerrymandering's terrible. I think it ought to be independent commissions making these decisions. But for now, we can't unilaterally disarm. So I think the more Democratic states can do this, the more likely it is that we can counteract the efforts that are going to take place in Texas and Ohio and other states. Because if left alone, they're going to do it themselves. And we will end up on the short end of the stick, even though we ought to win. Now, having said all of that, I think Trump's going to be in such bad shape and the Republicans are going to be in such bad shape by 2026 that no amount of gerrymandering is going to save them. I think they can lose as many as 40 seats. So if that's true, then the gerrymandering fight may not be nearly as important, but I wouldn't take that chance right now. What do you think?
One of the best places to look for some ideas there, I think, is Texas
Yeah.
itself, because Texas is a majority minority state now. and has been for a few years. And the Republicans have kept themselves in power purely through cheating, essentially, through gerrymandering. And there comes a point where you can gerrymander all you want to, and you still can't make that into a place where you get more votes for the minority group in that state. And of course, keep in mind that the Senate races, for example, are whole state races. There's no
Yeah.
district when it comes to a Senate race. I think that the gerrymandering will be it will fall out of favor eventually. I agree with you entirely that we have to fight fire with fire until we get to that point. But eventually, that I think we'll see big reforms with regard to districting. I don't know how long they'll last if they're put in place because we tend to wander away from such things eventually. But yeah, I think you nailed it. That we have to fight this one just like Newsom is doing. I think in the long run, um, that the nature of the population will settle out in such a way that we just it becomes less of an issue, at least for a
I
while.
think that over time that's going to be the case. I think the demography is changing. It's running against the Republicans, and I don't think that's going to ever reverse itself. Um, One of the things that disturbs me is how much I read about people um, saying that we're not going to have free and fair elections, that this is all just a lot of talk and we're wasting our time. And that just discourages me immensely because we have had a number of special elections and they've all gone the Democrats' way. Elon Musk dumped millions into that race, the judicial race in Wisconsin, and got clobbered. She won nearly every county. So even if they cheat, the numbers are against them. And I gather that a lot of people are of the belief that Trump is going to use some excuse like martial law to stop it. But I think that's a step too far. I think what he's going to do is he's going to get people out to the polls if he does that. What's he going to do? Fire on voters? I mean, I think there are limits to what he can do.
Yeah, you're right. There are limits, and I think that for him to go too far in that direction is will energize the American people pretty dramatically. For all of I think at heart you ask yourself the question: are Americans serious people? We seem pretty frivolous and sometimes downright nonsensical and not devoted to some strong ultimate principles. But underneath all that, you got 350 million people who've been accustomed to living in a democracy. They value their votes. They fight about them all the
Mm-hmm.
time. And when we get to the point that the chips are down, I think we'll have a relatively free and fair election for the simple reason the American people will demand it one way or another. It'll be a hot time when we get to voting. Of course, Trump came out of the room with Putin saying, "Oh, the main thing Putin said was you shouldn't have mail-in ballots." I kind of doubt that, but even if he did, um, that's not going to change in many respects. I think about my own state, and mail-in ballots have become a mainstay here. Well, they have to in a state like this because you there's no way to get from here to
True.
there without sending a piece of mail. So that's going to stay in place. We're going to have free and fair elections, and I think you're going to partly because of this fear that it might not be free and fair. You're going to see a huge turnout, and your estimate that we're going to gain a large number of seats, I think, is right on target. I think another factor there that is influential, and I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts about this. There has been a big push to see the Democratic Party change and to represent Americans in a different
Mm-hmm.
way instead of representing mainly the guiding lights in D.C., those big money interests and the uh, publicity groups that think they know how we should talk to Americans. Do you see the Democrats moving very much so far, and do you think they will increase the speed with which they make a change in order to appeal more to the average American?
I think we're in the midst of an epic fight right now. Um, it may be under the surface, but it's an epic fight. This is something I've talked about and written about over and over again. You have this iron triangle of consultants, of donors, and of old line politicians who all have a quote unquote centrist viewpoint. Now, if you ask them what they actually believe in, it's very hard to get them to divulge anything that resembles something that might appeal to the average American. It's all corporate sponsored. And a lot of the corporations that contribute money through their PACs to Democrats may be socially liberal, but they have more in common than Trump than we want to believe. And I think that causes us a lot of serious problems. They're doing their best to undermine Hamdani. They're doing their best to undermine 2 or 3 candidates in Michigan. This is going on elsewhere. At what point do you look at it and say, you are thwarting the will of the American people? These people want choice. Nobody's saying that people should anoint and elect progressive candidates without a proper primary, but they're trying to squash them before they ever get there. I mean, the effort to knock down Hamdani is disgraceful. I think it's an effort on the part of the center right wing of the Democratic Party to keep this fight from going on any further, and by declaring victory by just using their raw power. And I think it's going to backfire if they continue and they succeed.
I agree with you. I agree with you on that. I think you can sort of drill down on this kind of issue. For example, if you ask Americans, if you poll the popularity of Social Security, they all like Social Security. They want it to stay in place. Not all, of course. There's somebody opposed to everything, but most people in America like Social Security, and they want it to be there when they retire. They actually are strongly in favor now of the Affordable Care Act, although we went through quite a process getting to this point with that. In other words, the point I'm getting around to is that those elements of American society that the Republicans always want to point their finger at and say, this is socialism and you should reject it because why? I don't quite know, but that socialism tag always it stings, it seems. So I think you're exactly right that there are some elements of Trumpism that reflect that populist element of Americans, and the people who are trying to run things from D.C. are just not getting the fact that Americans are not like that, and I'm not sure they ever were. So I think we're going to see some changes. My only worry is how fast is that going to come along?
My inclination is going to be faster than we realize, because if this happens again, you're going to have an open revolt on the part of a lot of progressive Democrats who are going to say, you know what, this party isn't for us. And at that point, the Democrats are going to have to make a very hard choice, because if the party becomes divided, I'm not saying there's going to be a new party. I don't think that's going to be very easy. But if people take their balls and bats and go home because they feel like they're not considered part of the game, that's going to cost Democrats dearly in future elections. And if they're willing to pay that price, then we're all in trouble.
Yes. So I'm hoping that change does take place pretty rapidly. What concrete indicators have you seen recently that some of that is happening? What's the Democratic National Party doing to make that happen?
I don't see them doing anything. I see them continuing to defend the same old policies, and they're trying to sell them by claiming that, they're fighting back against Trump and they're doing this and they're doing that. But the fight against Trump is being undertaken by individual Democratic members, senators like Chris Murphy, like Chris Van Hollen, like Cory Booker, like Ed Markey and Jeff Merkley, and congresspeople like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Eric Swalwell, and Jasmine Crockett and various others. So it's being undertaken at a level that is consistent with the sort of philosophy that prevails on the left. So the fighting is happening from the left. That's the real fight. That's where the fight is coming from. Mm-hmm. All of the fight in the Democratic Party is coming from the left right now. Most of what's going on in the center is a lot of talk.
I see it that way too. And again, I would like to reiterate that the attitudes and the positions taken on the left of the Democratic Party, which, by the way, on the political spectrum internationally is not particularly to the left.
No.
It's just left of center. But it's always been popular with the American people, and the tension has been between it's a class thing as much as it is anything else. But the average person tends to have that more populist view, and the rich, they don't want to go down that road because they have to pay taxes if they do. So that's where that's where the battle really rages, is in that contest between the people and the rich, I
That's
think,
pretty much it.
and it always
It
will.
always will be. It's not. It's more of a class war than anything else. We're reaching the point now where the poor feel and the middle class feel they're completely disempowered, and they are. If you look at if you look where the way wealth is distributed in this country, it's shameful, and people know it,
It is.
and it can only continue for so long.
I would like to make one comment about that distribution of wealth. The average American really has a distorted view of that. They see that line that goes from where they stand up to where the extremely wealthy are as being a line that goes that below them they figure there are poor people. Then they're middle class and they're doing all right. And then it goes up and it hits a sort of a midpoint or a high point, but not extremely
Yeah,
high. The truth is different. The truth is there is a pretty flat line starting with the poorest American and going all the way up to people who are making a couple $100,000 a year. And then it starts going up a little bit gradually. But when it gets to the last 10% and then the last 1%, that line goes, it just skyrockets. It goes straight up. And that the wealth at that far end is monumental. And the average person down on the bottom end is making essentially nothing compared to what those folks are. It just, if people could just appreciate that the difference there is much larger than they can
it's
imagine.
exponential.
Um, it's huge. One thing I would like to ask you, Mark, that's been on my mind a
Yeah,
lot is the question of, we see this struggle going on in the Democratic Party and between us and the right wing, the Trumpists. What new tactics can you imagine that we ought to be using that we're not? What should we be doing to move the needle in both of these fights? Because they're similar fights, although between different parties.
I think the intra-democratic fight first. I think that people have to make their voices more loudly heard to the Democratic Party. I think the complaints have been loud, but I think they need to become louder and more insistent. And I think the party needs to be told in no uncertain terms how many of us there are, because there are many of us. And they need to understand that ignoring us will have consequences. That's one thing. On the other side, I think that the Democrats need to fight the Republicans with fire. You cannot go into a battle with these people with one arm tied behind your back. They will roll you. They have demonstrated, as Norman Ornstein and others have said, that they're not a serious party. They're a cult. And you can't fight a cult with conventional means, which is why I think you need to fight with gerrymandering. I think you need to fight with using, I don't want to say dirty tactics, but I'll say it anyway, dirty tactics to smear them, to make it clear who they are and what they are, not with lies, but with truth. We need to tell the truth about who they are, and we need to tell it without shame. We need to stop restraining ourselves. The Democratic Party needs to step out there and, without restraint, call out the Republicans for what they are. And I don't think we're doing it well enough yet. And as I said before, individuals are doing it, but the party management itself is still engaged in happy talk.
That makes good sense. I spent Friday out on the street in a
Mm-hmm.
demonstration, and it was fun to be there. It had an impact of sort. I was in a place where there were a lot of people driving by that were from out of town, and because we're a tourist center, and we heard a lot of horns honking, which were in support, and we saw a few middle fingers, which didn't encourage, but there are some of those. Um, I guess what I'm thinking is I do that sort of thing. A lot of people do. We write letters to the editor, which some people read, but most people don't. We make contributions to political candidates. Some of us get on Substack and write articles, that sort of thing. But I'm looking in my head for what the things are that really have an impact on the other side, and I recognize what you said is absolutely true. The cult-like attitude is not easily swayed. You're not going to find a magic bullet. But how can you continue the erosion of that other side? I think it's happening to some degree. Actually, I think the best argument that we're putting forth is simply by getting those images of ICE agents tackling and beating up some average guy who's just trying to make a
Yeah.
living and dragging him off and shipping him out to who knows where. That's a great
Yeah.
argument, and it breaks my heart to see those things happen, and I can't imagine why we're letting it go on.
But Trump is
But
doing our work for us.
looking
A
for
lot
those
of it.
effects, they are, and that's okay, and it's
It's
not
not a
okay actually
solution.
because it's too horrible. Yeah, but I'm trying to dig deeper, both for myself and for other people, and I think we're having trouble coming up with some of those answers that we really need. We go vote. I'm still looking for the magic bullet, I guess, Mark.
The magic bullet is voting, getting people out there. We need the people who didn't vote to come out and vote. We need Hispanics to flip on Trump. We need African Americans who voted for him to flip on him. And we need independents to flip on him. And according to all the polls, that's happening. So the process is underway. I don't think that we're completely devoid of solutions. What we're devoid of is a party that will fight and show people that, okay, Trump is bad. What are we? Who are we? What do
Yeah.
we represent? Who do we represent? What matters to us? Does what matter to us matter to you? We need to convey that to people, and we're not doing a good enough job of it. It's being done by individuals, not by the party as a whole. And I'll say that again and again and again until I get exhausted. But the bottom line is we're not doing a good enough job as a party telling people what we're going to do. We do it in generalities, but we don't talk about policies. And we're so scared of labels like socialist and like Medicare for all that we don't espouse policies that Americans want. Americans want good health care. They want an expansion of the Affordable Care Act. A lot of Americans actually want Medicare for all, or at least they want the choice. They want clean air. They want clean water. They want climate change reversed. They want good child care. They want all those things. Get out and talk about it.
I agree. That leads on to another thought, though. You've mentioned several leaders who are doing some effective
Yeah.
things right now, and making some changes at state levels, making the points that we need to make at state level. And in 2028, we're going to be looking for another presidential candidate. What kinds of thoughts might you be having about who's coming to the surface now, and what we should be looking for as you go forward in a leader for
I
28?
think simply somebody who can actually speak to all of those concerns that Americans have, somebody who's capable of doing it in a language that people can identify with rather than, the sort of generalities that the Democratic Party has been used to and the sort of avoidance of hot button words and issues that tend to scare people. Rephrase things. Talk about them in terms of the policies themselves rather than giving them labels. Don't worry about the labels. Forget the labels. Talk about the policies themselves. Who? I like Andy Beshear. I like J.B. Pritzker. Andy Beshear is the governor of Kentucky, for those of us who don't know who he is. He's a common sense progressive. He's been elected and reelected in a red state. He knows how to work with Republicans. He knows when to fight them and how to fight them. And he knows how to talk to people about what matters. He just absolutely flayed the administration over their treatment of Kentucky and FEMA's absence during the floods. He's passionate, especially when he gets rolling. And I like him a lot. Right now, he's my favorite, if I had to pick one. But J.B. Pritzker's terrific. Pete Buttigieg has got to come out and say something about Gaza. He had a chance last week and he blew it. I think it's going to be very hard for him to get elected if he can't come out and say that what's happening in Gaza is wrong and that Netanyahu needs to go. I think any Democratic candidate right now is going to be faced with a real problem if they don't want to come out against Netanyahu and his war cabinet. I think it's that simple. The Democratic Party is 91-9 against Netanyahu. And if you don't find a way to fight that fight in a way that is fair to Israel, but is also fair to the Palestinians and their right to exist, you're going to run into a lot of Democrats who are going to do exactly what they did last time, and that's stay home.
I agree with you. It's mind-boggling that people can't find it in their head and heart just to say the right thing at times. And you're sitting there waiting for it. You know, any minute they should say it, and yet it never falls out of their mouths. Um, I agree with you entirely in what you said a few minutes ago about policies too. We win on the policies whenever we
That's
talk
right.
about them, and yet we end up talking about stuff that isn't necessarily particularly important and ignore the policy, the labels, as you said, instead of the policies. Um,
There's a reason for that. The donors don't
one
want
of
us
the
talking
things,
about them.
right, and yes, I agree with that. One of the items we have such a marvelous opportunity in September because the Big Ugly Act is going to have to be picked apart in Congress. Each piece of it's going to have to be made into a law and funded. So that whole thing that they created and passed has to be has to be considered in detail now. But we have a great opportunity to make each of those arguments, each of those fights over those particular pieces, tremendously impactful in the upcoming elections and for the Democratic Party. One example that comes to my mind is that I can't remember always what it's called, but that piece of the Affordable Care Act that gives people a break on their premiums when they sign
Right.
up for
I can't remember what it's called either, but I know
for
exactly
health
what you
care.
mean.
Yeah, they're not renewing that. That's part of the
People
big
need to be
ugly. They didn't
reminded of
renew
that.
it. Well, here in Alaska, the average guy who's making $60,000 a year and has an Affordable Care Act health policy, his health insurance will go up approximately $13,000 per year if that is not renewed. Now, if people understood little things, that's a little thing, not a little thing in his life. That's something, the kind of thing that people need to
It's
understand.
almost a quarter of
And
his
the
income.
affordable this, yeah, yeah, it's horrible. He can't
No,
afford it. Bottom line is he
no.
can't do it. But the we have one item after another in that big ugly act that if we shout out about this, if we find every way we can to make that clear to the people in the country, I think we've got a good shot at defeating portions of it. Um, I know our own two senators and representative, if they go to the people with this hanging over their head and we make it loud enough, um, Dan Sullivan is up for
Mm-hmm.
reelection to the Senate, and of course our Begich, our representative, also. Um, can we change some votes? Can people, pull themselves away from Trump and not vote like they did in the first place? I don't know, but that's one of the important pieces of talking about policy. As you said, if you bring the policy to the fore and you say, here's what will happen to you if this passes and your senator has voted for it once, maybe he's going to vote for it again. I can see some nice television ads. I can see some nice ads in the paper and the like saying, you voted for this the first time. Now we know it'll do this. Do you still plan to vote
Make
for
it
this?
human.
To me, that's an impactful.
Make
Yeah,
it
it's an
human.
impactful thing because
You
yeah.
made a good point before about how to address the components of the big ugly bill. There's a military term called defeat in detail, where a general basically
Mhm.
takes the component parts of an army that's spread out and defeats them one at a time. And by doing so, defeats the whole. Essentially, the army disintegrates because it's been defeated in detail. This is how you take that bill on. You defeat it in detail. You take one component of it after another and crush it. Crush one and then come back and crush the next. Rather than try to take the whole thing in one bite, take it in bite-sized pieces, one at a time, so the public can absorb what you're doing.
One of the problems we have is that right now the public doesn't even know that that's
That's true.
happening. They don't understand the process, so they're not there
And
yet.
that's the
But
party's
we've
fault. It
got to
hasn't
make that
explained it.
apparent. Yeah, a policy, like you said, something they don't deal with
Talk
enough.
about what it's actually going to do to you. Talk about the fact that it's going to take a quarter of your income away. That makes people stand up and listen. But if you're not saying stuff like that, then people aren't going to. It's not going to resonate with people. It's just that simple. In the
Yes.
time we have left, I want to talk about one other issue. We've gone back and forth about this a little bit, but I want you to go into some detail about it because I know you have some views. This P2025 movement that seems to be buttressing Trump. What are your thoughts about it, and what's the danger there?
Well, my own background being in history, and by the way, Mark, I was never a professor of history, almost, but I was medieval and there were no jobs. So, um, but um, but you're right. Historically, we've seen a lot of this kind of thing of movements taking control of, or they've been in control of governments. Middle Ages, the government was the church, and to some fair degree. But this is a very dangerous thing for several reasons. One, because it restricts personal freedom so dramatically and forces everybody into the same box, and we don't all fit in there. And the second thing is, in the long run, this leads to a lot of violence and confrontation and bloodshed. Um, the most radical and dangerous movements in history, the ones that just set out to kill their own people, not go into, and in some cases it did result in general warfare all over Europe. The 30 Years' War was horrendous. But it's just a very dangerous thing. Historically, we should have learned that when government and religion are mixed, which is the goal of P 2025, to basically set up a theocracy, really bad things happen to both government and religion. No truly religious person who is basing his life on his religious beliefs I don't think should ever be thinking in terms of trying to impose it on somebody else. And yet that's been a hallmark of this group. That's what they want to do.
You know, just as an aside, the only amendment the Republicans seem to care about is the second.
Right.
Yeah, the
Exactly.
First Amendment
Yeah.
is completely anathema to them.
Well, if you go back and look at the process of and the Constitutional Convention, and you read the writings of the founding fathers, particularly James
Mm-hmm.
Madison, and if you look at the um, uh, gosh, term got out of my head. But at any rate, all of the writings from that period make very clear what their thinking was. They made a secular government for specific reasons. The colonies alone, if they only had what happened to the colonies early on to go by, that there were some very there were people who got run out of territories, who got hanged, who, there was a lot of violence over religion in the colonies themselves, a lot of
Yeah.
religious intolerance. So they perpetrated by the governments of those colonies at that time. So, yeah, the lessons there should be pretty plain. They were plain to the founding fathers. I'm not sure they're so plain to people now, but I think the average American, they read The Handmaid's Tale and they say, not for
Yeah,
us.
we don't want to live that way. Last thought. We're facing a situation now where Trump, in his desperation, may start putting troops on the streets of every blue city in the country. What do you think happens if that takes place? Because there are demonstrations
That's
here in
been on
Washington right
everybody's
now as we speak.
that's been on should have been on a lot of people's minds because of what's happened over the last few days, particularly in D.C. I think Trump pushes things like that in order to find out how far he can go. And if Americans don't push back and say, no, we're not going to have this, I think we're in deep doo-doo, as it were. It's good to see the demonstrations in D.C. I don't think there should be anybody sitting in his living room when these take place, that everybody needs to be on the streets. And if that happens, unless somebody's willing to just open fire on American citizens, and I hope that's not something that would
Me
happen.
too.
Um, yeah, I mean, they can't, they make things worse, never better, by getting troops on the streets like that.
Any final thoughts?
Yeah, I, I, I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate the work of an awful lot of Substackers. They're saying providing what you might call a philosophical and intellectual basis for some very nitty-gritty work out on the streets. And I think it is a foundational thing. It needs to be there, and I'm really glad you're doing that. I hope we keep moving in that direction. Good luck to all of us. It's going to be a tough struggle, but I think we're going to get there. Your optimism is worth a lot, and I think I think you're accurate.
Well, thank you for that. I try to remain optimistic. I think there's reason to be, and I think there are a lot of good people on Substack and other fora that are doing great work. I think it's really important that we continue to write and to speak and to think and to be out there, because I think that the Democratic Party needs to be pressed, and I think the Republican Party needs to be fought. And I think that if we do those two things, we'll be okay. With that,
yes.
Thank you all for joining us today. Thank Ron for coming on, and we'll continue the conversation.